Just under a decade ago, I had been introduced to a tabletop RPG. Excitement filled me because I wanted to play. So I started up a game with a couple of friends, which eventually became a years-long campaign. That first session was also the official introduction of the game for one of my friends, and the excitement for the game gripped him similarly to how it did for me. So much so that he would do battle reports with his younger brother quite often. And obviously, those little stories built excitement in my friend's younger brother as well. A person who's also become a friend of mine since. That younger brother played with us for some time, but he also used his excitement for the game to spread the enjoyment with others. One day, this younger brother said to me, "Thank you for introducing my brother to this game, because if you hadn't, then I wouldn't have ever played this game that's meant so much to me." This idea of passing on to others something that you've experienced is often the way that we're introduced to things. Whether it be a friend, a parent, a teacher, a significant other, or anyone else. Their experience of something gripped them enough to share it with us. And often we then wish to share this thing with someone else. We sing the praises of this TV show, or this movie, or this book, or this theological concept. I know that's where most of my blog ideas come from. There's just an urge to share what I've been learning with others. It's not like this idea of sharing with others what we've learned is new to humanity. It's part of what caused our ancestors to pass on the stories and lessons that they've learned to the next generation. And this core idea is what the passage for this sermon, 2 Samuel chapter 9, is all about. Up until this point in the book of Samuel, at least as far as the story arc of David is concerned, we've seen David be shown amazing promises from God. Yahweh promised David that he would be king over all Israel, and recently in our series, which we've titled A Song of Failures and Hope, we've witnessed God make a covenant with David that he'd build a house for the human king. A promised covenant that was completely fulfilled through Jesus, but had other fulfillments during David's reign. Fulfillment like the peace brought around all Israel, as we saw in the last couple of chapters. Time and again, David witnessed God's fulfillment of his covenants, loyalty to the promise. Now, as we arrive in chapter 9, we come to David's turn to share with others the same type of covenant loyalty that he had received. He's passing on what he has learned from God. In particular, David is sharing through a covenant that he had made long ago. So long ago that we might have even forgotten that he had made it. His covenant with his best friend, even though death had long separated them. 2 Samuel chapter 9, verses 1 to 4. And David said, "Is there still anyone left of the house of Saul, that I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake?" Now there was a servant of the house of Saul whose name was Ziba, and they called him to David. And the king said to him, "Are you Ziba?" And he said, "I am your servant." And the king said, "Is there not still someone of the house of Saul, that I may show the kindness of God to him?" And Ziba said to the king, "There is still a son of Jonathan. He is crippled in his feet." The king said to him, "Where is he?" And Ziba said to the king, "He's in the house of Machir, the son of Amiel, at Lodabar." It's no coincidence that the author of the book placed this story after showing Yahweh being loyal and faithful to the covenant with David. The purpose is to show what motivated the human king to seek out a descendant of Saul to show his own kindness, his own covenant loyalty to. For those who need a refresher about what covenant David made, this is because of the covenant that he made with Jonathan back in 1 Samuel chapter 20, the last time the pair of friends saw each other alive. In the timeline of history, that had been about 15 to 20 years previous of where we are now in 2 Samuel chapter 9. Back then, Jonathan had asked David to not consider him or his descendants enemies, even when Yahweh had cut off the enemies of David from the face of the earth. Well, here is the point where the enemies of David had been cut off from the face of the earth, and though Jonathan was no longer alive, the covenant had included his house as well. Thus, David knew it was time to show the love that led him to make the covenant. It was time to share the covenant loyalty he'd been given by God. And so David looks around to see if anyone knew of a descendant of Saul to whom the king could show his faithfulness. No one seemed to know of a descendant, but they did know of a servant of Saul, who likely had been tending the lands that had once belonged to their former king. If anyone knew where a descendant was, it would probably be that servant, who was named Ziba. Now I can only imagine what's going through Ziba's head when he's summoned to the king's presence. The animosity that Saul had for David was obvious for all. And there were probably still conspiracy theories floating around the land that both Abner's death and Ishbosheth's death had been at the command of David, regardless of the fact that the king had truly mourned the deaths of both men. It makes me wonder if Ziba had thought that David was slowly working through anybody who'd been connected to Saul. And when the words of King David sounded in his ears, the thought might have still been there, regardless of David's reassurances for the opposite. I mean, every other king's prerogative would have been to eliminate any other claims to the throne, and direct descendants to the previous king were the first targets. No one would believe that a king in David's position would actually seek out the welfare for his supposed enemy, the very thing that every other claimant to the throne would usually be seen as. And even though Ziba sells out Mephibosheth, Jonathan's son, the addition of his disability, which we'd heard him mentioned a few chapters ago, was likely Ziba's way of hoping that David would have lenience toward this supposed enemy claimant. I'm making a big deal about Ziba's likely perspective because no one in their right mind would ever believe that a king in David's position would actually seek to not only reconcile with, but also seek the benefit of, a person who could be considered their enemy. As a matter of fact, there are even some less than godly perspectives about what David actually does in this chapter. Some people read the upcoming words and say that Mephibosheth was under David's watchful eye, so that he couldn't try to usurp the throne. They see an unofficial imprisonment with metaphorical chains disguised as kindness, instead of just the bestowing of covenant loyalty to Mephibosheth that this was. Some people, some who even teach from this passage, try to say that David is just being manipulative here. In my opinion, those who hold such a position have never experienced the covenant loyalty of God, or at the very least, they deny its presence in David's life. Because when we realize that David is only doing for Mephibosheth what Yahweh had done for him, then King David's motivations are perfectly clear. He's doing this unheard of thing because God had done the unheard of for him. He's sharing the covenant loyalty that led him to this position. The covenant loyalty from God. The God who chose a bunch of nobodies to become his cherished nation. The God who still chooses to make a spiritual family out of people who had once been his enemies. The God who died for sinners to cleanse their sins. Once we experience that type of covenant loyalty, that kind of faithfulness, how can we ever question the motivations of one who experienced the same thing while they're seeking the welfare of one who's supposed to be their enemy? So I truly believe that this is David showing his covenant loyalty, his loyalty to the covenant he made with Jonathan, acting exactly as God has done in his covenant loyalty to David. So David calls for Mephibosheth and witnesses the same type of humility that David himself had given to Yahweh. 2 Samuel chapter 9, verses 5 to 8. Then King David sent and brought him from the house of Machir, the son of Ammiel, at Lo-debar. And Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, son of Saul, came to David and fell on his face and paid homage. And David said, Mephibosheth? And he answered, Behold, I am your servant. And David said to him, Do not fear, for I will show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. And I will restore to you all the land of Saul your father, and you shall eat at my table always. And he paid homage and said, What is your servant that you should show regard for his dead dog such as I? Notice one interesting thing about the shift in reference to David in this text. From the moment that Ziba enters King David's presence in verse 2, until the point at which Mephibosheth falls on his face in humility before the king, David is never referred to as just David. The terms used for him were the king, or King David. In these moments, David is the one in authority, the one who held the prominent role, the higher side of the covenant. David's the one in power, bestowing grace and favor and faithfulness. It's in these little reminders that we see that David truly is passing on to others the same covenant loyalty that Yahweh had given to him, when Yahweh was in the higher authority and David in the lower. So while David is now in the higher authority, he is bestowing upon others the same thing. And we see Mephibosheth take on the role of recipient of that grace. He does it perfectly. Remember, Mephibosheth had that crippling accident earlier in his life. It was impossible for him to walk. And I don't know if he came in on crutches or if he was carried in, or if they had some version of an ancient wheelchair for him. But think about how much more of an effort it would take for someone with injured feet and or legs to get down on the ground and lie on their face. It was even more of a posture of total surrender than it would be for anyone with full mobility. Mephibosheth certainly couldn't run away, or dodge any attack that someone like his grandfather might have made. The definition of vulnerability. Mephibosheth's posture could be described as nothing else but humility. And even with his limited ability, he laid himself bare before his king. There is beauty in that humility. And if we switch perspectives back to David for a second, I can't help but wonder how much of Jonathan that David saw in Mephibosheth, his best friend in the whole world. The man with whom he'd covenanted that he would be David's right hand in ruling, if history had turned out a little bit differently. And no doubt, the story of Mephibosheth's crippling accident following Jonathan's death had been reported to David by this point in time as well. The swelling music in the background obviously had to be the melody of the bow, which David had penned for his fallen brother. But one thing I'm sure of, when David saw the humble face of Mephibosheth, he didn't see an enemy claimant of the throne. Rather, David saw only his friend Jonathan and the covenant that they had made together, the covenant to which David would be faithful to keep. From his throne, David questions, "Are you Mephibosheth?" And when the man laid bare on the floor humbly says, "Behold your servant," David's heart is moved. I can't help but see David's next words accompanying his rise from the throne to help Mephibosheth back to his seat or to his crutches. Don't be afraid. Words that often arrive before the good news of covenant loyalty. Perhaps David felt the trembling body of Mephibosheth as he helped the prone man to rise. Regardless, David continues, "I will show you covenant loyalty, faithfulness, loving kindness, not because of anything that you have done, but because of another." In Mephibosheth's case, it was because of his father Jonathan. And then comes the restoration and calling of Mephibosheth to sit like an adopted member of the king's family. The restoration in this case is of Saul's tribal lands, and that was even though Mephibosheth need not ever worry again where his next meal will come from, because he will sit forever at David's table, in a spot that was covenanted for Jonathan, but will now be Mephibosheth's. This is what the love of God can do for people. Even those not directly given his grace can benefit from it when we share it with those around us. And I want us to notice once again the humility from Mephibosheth even after the good news had been given. He says, "What is your servant that you should show regard to a dead dog such as I?" That phrase, dead dog, is one that David himself had cried out in the hearing of Saul. It's a posture of humility that David himself had taken, the words likely bringing back so many memories to the king, but even more so, spoke of true humility. That is why Mephibosheth's humility is the same as David's. Even just the question, "Who am I?" leads to the same idea. Who am I that such grace and favor should be given? Who am I that you would show me such covenant loyalty? The answer can only be, you are the one to whom I have chosen to show my covenant loyalty. That is who you are. Nothing else can explain the situation. And even those words don't compute, because Mephibosheth should be considered David's enemy, based on every metric of fallen human regard. But that's not the case when it comes to covenant loyalty, because the way the humans think, it's not the way of God. It's only because of God, only because we've been shown by God that we can share with others the same type of covenant loyalty that has been shown to us. And just as Yahweh didn't leave David to his own devices once the covenant loyalty had been shown, David also does not leave Mephibosheth without the ability to tend to the lands that are now his. 2 Samuel chapter 9, verses 9 to 13. Then the king called Ziba, Saul's servant, and said to him, "All that belonged to Saul and to all his house I have given to your master's grandson. And you and your sons and your servants shall till the land for him, and shall bring in the produce, that your master's grandson may have bread to eat. But Mephibosheth your master's grandson shall always eat at my table." Now Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. Then Ziba said to the king, "According to all that my lord the king commands his servant, so will your servant do." So Mephibosheth ate at David's table like one of the king's sons. And Mephibosheth had a young son whose name was Micah. And all who lived in Ziba's house became Mephibosheth's servants. So Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem, for he ate always of the king's table. Now he was lame in both his feet. David calls the servant Ziba back to the throne room. Mephibosheth might have even been given a plush royal chair to sit in this exchange. Whether that's true or not, David motions towards the living Mephibosheth and says, "I have given all of Saul's lands back to his grandson," likely the very lands that Ziba had already been tending. Only now, what that land produces is under the discretion of Mephibosheth. The family of David's enemy would have an inheritance, because David was faithful to his covenant, just as Yahweh is with his. I think that's part of the reason why Mephibosheth's son Micah is named here. The family line will continue through the humble line of Jonathan, the humble line of Mephibosheth. Yet the favor hadn't stopped there, because we again get the words that Mephibosheth need not ever worry about his own food. He'd eat at the table of the king for the rest of his life, just like one of the king's very own sons. There's something important in those words. With absolutely no action from the man who could not provide for himself without struggle and pain and failure because of his disability, the king bestows the honor of covenant loyalty and a place among his children, and he accepts it with true humility. How can we read anything other than our own selves and our own fallen, sinful state, with King Jesus bestowing upon us the grace and favor because of his own covenant loyalty through the sacrifice of the cross? How can we not see ourselves with our spiritual disability of sin when we look at Mephibosheth? How can we not humbly bow our faces to the ground when we come before the King of everything, when he shows us the extent of his covenant loyalty? How can we not ask, "Who am I that you would bestow this favor upon me, a dead dog?" We followers of Jesus have been granted an amazing measure of covenant loyalty, and we should be humble through it, because of it. But even more so, we should pass on what we have learned, pass on what we've been given, show the covenant loyalty to those who by every metric should be considered our enemies. We who have received God's faithfulness should show that loving kindness to others, even if they are a people who would be considered our enemies. How do we do that? David gave a place at his table, like one of his very own sons, as God has done with us, making us his family through Jesus. Can we not provide a place at our own tables? Can we not welcome people who disagree with us, people who hate us, people who consider us their enemies? Can we not get up off of our thrones to help our fellow human being who has been broken down by the problems of this life as we help them see the covenant loyalty that we have received? Why is it that we can sing the praises of some TV show, some movie, or some book, but be unwilling to share the best good news of Jesus? Has our relationship with him lost the excitement that can't help but talk with it about anyone who will listen? Have we lost that first love that we once had? Have we become complacent at our own place at the King's table? I can't answer the question for anyone but me, but I do have to admit that when I think about Mephibosheth, I want to have that kind of humility. And when I look at David, I want to share God's covenant loyalty that he has with me. I told you, I have an urge to share what I've been learning. So let's humbly bow before our King and be willing to share God's covenant loyalty with others, whether they be friend or enemy.